We're probably ready to get started. We have quite a few people already and some more might join us, but I think it's after 10. So welcome to Mark's book launch presentation for his new book, Rediscovering Wonderland. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Phillips. I'm the research coordinator at the Gallatin History Museum in Bozeman, Montana. And the museum here, we have, besides a museum exhibits, of course, we're located in the old county jail building, but we have a very active research library, and we publish a quarterly magazine with local history topics. And Mark was one of our longtime volunteers here, probably, I don't know, 15 years or so, I would guess. And he just recently moved. So we were thrilled to be able to do his book launch presentation over Zoom. So a couple things before we get started. A lot of people are joining us now, but if everyone could keep their computers on mute, that would be wonderful. That'll help us get to see Mark and his screen without other screens jumping in. So that would be great to stay on mute. And something else, we'll have some time for questions at the end. And I discovered the other day that there's under the reactions button at the bottom of the screen on Zoom, there's an option to raise your hand. So that will come in handy when we do questions at the end. So again, with questions at the end, we'll stay on mute too, and you can hit that raise your hand button and then we'll know you have a question and we can call on you that way. We are recording the presentation so that folks that can't join us will be able to see it later. And with that, I think I will introduce Mark and we'll get started. So Mark Miller is a fifth-generation Montanan who grew up on a cattle ranch in southwest Montana, about 90 miles from Yellowstone Park. His interest in Yellowstone history began when he was a small boy listening to his grandmother's trips there in 1909 and her father and grandfather's trip there in 1882. And he is the author of several other books related to Yellowstone history, Adventures in Yellowstone, Stories of Yellowstone, Side Saddles and Geysers, Encounters in Yellowstone, and Macon's Perfect Shot. And his new book, the one that we're going to be talking about today, Rediscovering Wonderland, is now available through the Gallatin History Museum. And I think most of you probably got the link to that book for sale on our website that I sent out yesterday. But if not, you're welcome to check it out at gallatinhistorymuseum.org. And then there's a tab for bookstore and gifts. And his new book is under the Yellowstone section. So with that, I will turn it over to Mark and hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Rachel. I was a volunteer at the Gallatin History Museum for about 20 years, nearly 20 years. And it was one of my favorite things to do in Bozeman. So if you're ever in that part of the country, stop by. Great displays, really good county museum, superlative. You may be wondering why I titled my book Rediscovering Yellowstone. That is, why not just discovering Yellowstone? And of course, that's because I think that Yellowstone was pretty well known by the time the group that I'm talking about, the Washburn expedition, visited there in 1870. Rediscovering Wonderland is a particularly timely publication. Came out just this month, but 2022 is the 150th anniversary of the establishment of Yellowstone National Park. And this expedition was instrumental in that happening. So I'll tell you a little bit about this expedition, read a few short excerpts, and try to entice you into buying the book, or at least maybe if you haven't already. Despite claims of members of the Washburn expedition, the wonders of the headwaters of the Yellowstone and Madison rivers were known by Euro-Americans for at least 50 years. John Coulter, who had been a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, stayed in the West as the expedition went home and hired out for some of the trapping companies that were getting started there. And he came through the area that was Yellowstone Park in 1807. He later went down the river back to St. Louis, where William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition was the commissioner of Indian Affairs, and he told Clark what he had seen. Clark published a map in 1816 that included Coulter's descriptions of Yellowstone Lake, of the canyon, and of geysers in the area. So we can be pretty confident that Coulter saw the wonders of Yellowstone Park well before the expedition. And of course, many trappers visited the area beginning about 1820. The War of 1812 interrupted the beaver trade, so the trappers didn't make it into Yellowstone Park very often until about 1820. But several trappers went through the park and left accounts of their trips in various places. Most of those publications were pretty obscure, but historians have found them, and we know that men were there. About 1840, men's styles changed in Europe from beaver hats to silk hats. The silk trade had opened to the Orient, and the beaver trade largely collapsed. So there was a quiet period in the Yellowstone Park area from about 1840 into the 1860s, when gold was discovered in Montana and prospectors began exploring the area. So reports got back to civilization, particularly to the towns, gold rush towns in Montana, and it became pretty credible that there were wonders in there. The trapper and prospector's tales had largely been dismissed as tall tales, but there were just too many credible reports for that to be sustained. Okay, let's see. There we go. So mountain men's tales got no respect. And that, I guess, I have been through. So we'll go to the next slide if we can. There we go. This is a quote from a newspaper report from 1867, 3 years before the Washburn expedition.
Victoria will come at 10 on Thursday.
And let's see. Please put your Zoom on mute for me so we don't get things crossways. Thanks, John. This is a quote from a sentence that I found. The full sentence runs 96 words, and I thought making a slide with all of those words on it, but I thought it would be better to be kind. This is the essence of what that sentence was about. And it says pretty definitively that there are wonders in the upper Yellowstone and Madison, and that there really needs to be something done there. This is the next sentence. It talks about an expedition that is being planned in 1867 to visit the park area. And a couple things that I want you to notice in this sentence are gentlemen. It wants people who aren't prospectors, trappers, miners, looking for upper crust people. And it wants people who can write. So they're seeing the purpose of the expedition to have have the wonders documented by credible people who can write. And that's worth noting. This handsome guy is Nathaniel P. Langford. Langford saw the opportunity that was presented by the fact that there were wonders in the upper Yellowstone that hadn't been documented thoroughly or credibly. Langford was the state tax commissioner for Montana Territory. He had been appointed governor of Montana, but the Senate failed to confirm him. And so he was kind of at loose ends. And he looked for an opportunity for fame and fortune by documenting the wonders of what is now Yellowstone Park. Langford may have been more interested in fortune than fame. We know that he went to New York City and visited with the executives of the Northern Pacific Railroad, then returned immediately in the spring of 1870 and began organizing this troop, this expedition to the Yellowstone. He, well, let's go on. This handsome fellow is Gustavus Doane, and when he heard that the expedition was being organized, he immediately began to finagle his way to be the commander of the expedition. Doane at that time was stationed at Fort Ellis, just east of Bozeman, Montana, and he was a very ambitious guy. He apparently was more interested in fame than fortune, but he really wanted to be on that expedition because he saw it as an opportunity to gain notoriety. And in fact, he spent his whole life trying to join explorations and become a famous explorer. And remember, this is the era when you could get famous by documenting things that were well understood, like the headwaters of the Nile. The Nile River has to begin somewhere, or going to the North Pole, which has to be there, or the South Pole, or the interior of South America. So the opportunities were there for these guys. One of the things I've always wondered about Doane, and kids could get no information on, is that wonderful mustache of his. I find it very doubtful that he waxed that mustache when he was on the expedition going through the park. So it must have drooped down. It must have been a remarkable thing to see that mustache droop down, as it certainly is to see it waxed up like that. There are many photographs of Doane. He wore that mustache for the rest of his life. This guy is Henry Dana Washburn. He was a distinguished Civil War general, and he was the Surveyor General of Montana Territory. Doane took the job of Surveyor General because his health was bad and his doctors advised him to move west to a drier climate. And that was the job that was open, and he could get Ulysses S. Grant to appoint him there. He was a great leader for the expedition. He was chosen according to the information now. We can't tell if he was elected or what, but he certainly was a distinguished person and a good leader. He organized the expedition. He organized guards for overnight to protect the expedition against Indians, which was something they worried about a lot because that is what prevented earlier expeditions from entering the park. He was a sickly man, and he died about a year later. I tend to call this the Washburn expedition. Some people call it the Washburn-Doane expedition. Others call it the Washburn-Doane-Langford expedition, and other combinations. But I like General Washburn, and it's an easier way to say things. Langford was the principal spark plug behind the expedition. And he recruited people, as that quote from the Montana Post said, basically to be distinguished and credible people and people who could write. So he had, in addition to Washburn, several businessmen, some of his assistants, just a whole bunch of people. There were 9 distinguished characters that he took on the expedition. He seemed to pay attention only to those credentials. He really didn't have anybody on that expedition who was an outdoorsman, except for one person. He did try to get James Stewart, who was a Montana pioneer. James Stewart and his brother Granville discovered the first major gold strike in Montana. And so Stewart was both wealthy and prominent and a guy that knew his way around the outdoors. But Stewart got called for jury duty and couldn't go on the expedition. So that left him down to one guy who really knew his way around, and a couple of guys who really didn't. That always struck me as strange because there was a pretty long list of people who could have guided the expedition into the park. That is, the prospectors, several of them in Montana, Yellowstone Jack Baronet, for example, was a prospector who had been in the area. He was available. Walter de Lacy, who led another prospecting expedition into the park, actually was working for General Washburn in the Surveyor General's office. And he was out doing another survey, so he was still a vigorous outdoorsman at that time. He was available. And then there were various settlers like Fred Butler, who had the first permanent ranch in Yellowstone Valley and had visited the park several times. And I just wondered about that. My guess is that it's a lot easier to claim that you discovered something if you don't have somebody who knows their way to guide you there. But that's just my conjecture. This is the route of the expedition going through the park. And we'll talk a little about that. They left Bozeman, well, actually, they left Fort Ellis just to the east of Bozeman on August 22nd. So they went in summer, and that becomes important to some of the comments later. Crossed over the mountains on Trail Creek Pass to comment on what they could see, both in the Gallatin Valley back toward Bozeman and in the Yellowstone Valley, which was just being settled at that time, and made their way up the Yellowstone River through what's now called Yankee Jim Canyon and entered the park. And you see Everett's found. We'll talk about that later. We've got to get Everett's lost before we can get him found. But on into the park. And the next thing I want to talk about is their camp at Tower Falls. They camped several times before then. Let me comment that the next several images I'm going to share with you are watercolor sketches by Thomas Moran, who was a painter who accompanied the Hayden expedition the next summer after this expedition. And I just love Hayden's pictures of the park. This is his picture of Tower Falls. While the expedition was making its way to Tower Creek, they discovered they were following several lodges of Crow Indians that were headed into the park. And those Indians turned northward at Tower Falls and disappeared and weren't seen again. The expedition was posting guards every night and continued to do that for fear of Indians, but had no real problems going through the park. So they were no longer following Indians when they got there. They spent a day at Tower Fall, and it really should be called Tower Fall, no S on the end. It's just one great plunge down the side. It's not a series of falls. Tower Fall, climbing the spires, measuring the height of the fall, looking at hot springs in the area. But let me pause and read you an excerpt of one of the things that happened at Tower Fall. When they began the expedition, members of the party agreed not to name any sites they saw after anybody in the party or relatives and friends. The agreement caused a good-natured debate about the naming of the creek and fall. Walter Trumbull suggested Minaret, and Walter and Sam Hauser suggested Tower. The explorers debated the proposal and then voted for Minaret by a small margin. The next evening, Hauser solemnly announced that the group had violated its agreement not to name features after people they knew. He claimed a well-known family, the Retts, lived in St. Louis, and they had a charming daughter named Minnie. Hauser accused Trumbull of proposing her name, Minnie Rett, to honor his girlfriend. Trumbull denied Hauser's accusation, but Hauser insisted it was true. The men again put the question to a vote, and Tower won by a small margin. Later, it was surmised that it was Hauser who had a sweetheart in St. Louis, a Miss Tower. So that's the story. You know, I wish you were unmuted for a second so I could tell if you chuckled appropriately for that. I think that's a really fun little story. And I hope it gives you a sense of some of the things in the book. I tried to bring these people to life. Historians, when they talk about this expedition, are often very dry. In my book, I try to get to those little stories and anecdotes that bring some color to it. The expedition waited a day at Tower Fall, and General Washburn went ahead to scout the route. He went to the top of what's now called Mount Washburn and saw the way to Yellowstone Lake. And from the top of the pass, you can see Yellowstone Lake. So he knew he was headed in the right direction. And the expedition promptly named the mountain after General Washburn in violation of the agreement we just talked about. For some reason, mountains seem to be the exception of things, and so there were mountains named after Washburn, after Langford, after Doan, and another member or two of the expedition, which strikes me as strange. They made their way south from Tower Falls toward the lake over what is now Dunraven Pass. They stopped at the top of the pass. Some proceeded on up to the top of Mount Washburn, where there's a phenomenal view of the lake and the Teton Mountains beyond, and then on down. On the way, they passed some dramatic geothermal features, one of them that was so ugly and terrifying that they named it Hellroth Springs, and gave descriptions of that. And then they came upon Yellowstone Canyon and the Great Falls of the Yellowstone half a day sooner than they expected to. And they stopped there to explore. And they spent several days measuring the height of the falls, both upper and lower, tried to estimate the depth of the canyon, and just admired the scenery. Were really taken with the wonders there. One of the members, Hauser, who we mentioned before, was a civil engineer and surveyor. So he measured the height of the falls with his surveying equipment and a little bit of trigonometry. But that wasn't good enough for other men who lowered ropes down and touched the water and then measured the length of ropes that they had let down to measure the falls. For what it's worth, they were within a few feet of the same measure and they were all wrong, but that's another story. I wanted to read another little excerpt at this point about an exploration of the falls. To explore the bottom of the canyon, Lieutenant Doane and Private George McConnell wended their way through the thick forest 3 miles down game trails until they came to a stream that ran into the canyon. They tied their horses and waded down the stream bed. As the pair headed down the stream canyon, they encountered sulfur-belching hot springs. One of those springs had built an enormous horn of sulfur with water trickling down its side. The creek ran over a bed of solid rock that was smooth and slippery. The men waded down the treacherous creek 3 miles until they came to a shelf in the canyon where they found a large flock of bighorn sheep. McConnell shot one of the sheep, but the rest scrambled away on the canyon walls with alacrity that astonished Lieutenant Doane. Below the shelf, the creek headed downward sharply, so Doane and McConnell had to climb even more carefully. They scrambled over masses of rock and fallen timber and splashed through warm water and ducked under cascades that fell from the shelves in the canyon wall. They skirted around boiling cauldrons where hot springs bubbled up from the creek bed. The pair toiled downward for 4 hours before reaching the bottom of the canyon. They were wet, exhausted, and famished with thirst, but the river water was warm and impregnated with alum and sulfur, so it was hard to drink. The sides of the canyon were riddled with springs, some that left deposits of calcium and others of sulfur. These springs came in black, blue, and red. Doane said the canyon floor was so oppressively hot that despite a stiff breeze that grew constantly down the canyon, he said, a frying sound comes constantly to the ear, mingled with a rush of the current. The place abounds in sickening and purgatorial smells. Doane and McConnell had traveled 4 miles down the creek and could look up the canyon wall to the sky and to the edge of the canyon. Tall trees there looked just an inch or two high. Doane said the sunlight didn't reach the bottom of the canyon, and when the men looked up, they could see stars twinkling in the sky. Pretty dramatic description. I think the statement by Doane that they could see stars twinkling in the sky is probably an exaggeration. The canyon doubtless is dark at the bottom, but it doesn't keep the sun from shining. So that strikes me as a little unusual. But it was an arduous climb down, and that's even more arduous climb up. They didn't make it back to camp till well after dark, so it was a good thing. But it's kind of, I chose that excerpt because I think it tells you the kind of things these men were doing. They were stopping to explore whenever they could. They were measuring. They were going where they could. Lieutenant Doane was required by his commanders to write a report of what he saw, something he took very seriously and wrote a report when he returned to Fort Ellis. So that's the first official report to the U.S. government by someone who actually saw the sights in the park. And it's really a well-written, good report. Here's Moran's picture of the lower falls. falls of the Yellowstone. I'm getting a little bit out of sync and saying things in different order than I planned, but that's okay. Yellowstone Lake. When the expedition left the falls and canyon, they headed southward up the Yellowstone River through meadows and past forests. Really had a pleasant trip. They encountered several geothermal springs and things that they noted in their journals and observations. Langford at one point crawled out to the edge of a pool to gather sulfur crystals that he thought were worth collecting there, and nearly fell in. That was another excerpt I thought about reading to you, but moved on. When they got to the lake, they veered east and then south and traveled along the east side of Yellowstone Lake. That was an unfortunate choice because that meant they had to go through thick timber and boggy areas that really slowed down their travel to a crawl. And outside of game, there was little for them to see there. It wasn't a very interesting thing, but it was an arduous thing. Had they headed down the west side of the lake where the roads go now, that's a very easy trip in the Hayden Valley, or at least a relatively easy trip. One of the things that was happening during this trip, Lieutenant Doan, as he was leaving Fort Ellis, noticed that he had what he called a felon on his thumb, an abscess that became progressively worse as he traveled through the park. And the further along he got, the more frantic he got, riding from spring to spring to shove this hand into the cold spring and numb it up. But that didn't work. Langford kept asking Doan for permission to lance the abscess, but Doan demurred until Langford noted that he had chloroform in his medical kit. And the pain was getting so bad that Doan could hardly even walk. So he finally agreed to let Langford lance the sore on his thumb. Here's another excerpt. Doan's sonorous snores greeted the men on the morning of September 4th. The lieutenant was sleeping soundly for the first time in 9 days because Langford had lanced his felon the night before. Doan finally agreed to the surgery after his hand had swollen so much and he was in constant and severe pain. For days, he had been running around looking for frigid springs into which he could plunge his hand and numb the pain. But that and the opiates he took didn't work anymore. Even the slightest movements hurt so bad that he could hardly walk. Langford recruited 2 strong men to hold Doan down. When the men were in position, Doan asked, "Where's the chloroform?" Langford confessed that he wasn't sure he could administer the drug safely and wasn't going to use it. But Langford swallowed his disappointment and laid his hand on an ammunition box. The men grabbed the lieutenant and held him down. Langford shoved his penknife blade into the bloated thumb and split it to the end. According to Langford, Doan gave one shriek as the released corruption flew in all directions upon the surgeon and his assistants. Then a broad smile lit up Doan's face and he exclaimed, "That was elegant." So the story of lancing Doan's felon. Again, another story of the kinds of things that these men were going through as they traveled through the park. Another important incident that happened at the south end of the lake, the expedition's oldest member, a man named Truman Edwards, who was 54 years old, got lost. And this is one of the most famous stories of the expedition. Men often got separated as they traveled through the park, and this thick timber, they just separated out and tried to make their way through. But Edwards lost his way and climbed off his horse to look for tracks. As I mentioned, he was very nearsighted. So as he bent down to search the trail and see if his companions were ahead of him, his horse ran away, leaving him only with his clothing and the stuff in his pockets. That is, his horse ran away with his rifle, his blanket, and everything he had. So he was pretty well stuck there. But Edwards was a plucky man who managed to survive. And he had many adventures that he wrote about later in an article for Scribner's Magazine, one of the most popular magazines of the era. And here, some of the things that happened to him: he was treed by a lion. He waited out a 2-foot snowfall in a shelter that he built over a pair of hot springs so he could keep warm. He fended off starvation by eating thistle roots, and captured a frozen bird. So he was an enterprising man. The expedition had to wait out this 2-foot storm while Edwards was snuggling behind the hot spring, where he got scalded, by the way. And then they spent several days looking for Edwards. Finally, they had to move on because they were simply running out of food. They left one man from the expedition and 2 of Doan's soldiers behind to look, but they didn't find him either. So Edwards was alone in the wilderness, wandering around for 37 days. And the story of Edwards' search and the Edwards' ordeal and the search for him are detailed in the book. It's the only place I know of that puts the several accounts together. Edwards' own account is quite interesting, but it has to be taken a little bit with a grain of salt. Edwards apparently began hallucinating from starvation, so he reports seeing ghosts and talking to his hands and feet and several things that seem unlikely. So that story of Truman Edwards is quite a story. After they left, let's see, where are we? We're going to the geysers now. After the expedition rounded the lake, they headed westward toward the upper geyser basin. And they weren't sure of their route. They didn't know how to get there. So they were kind of fighting their way over the Continental Divide here. They had to pass over from the drainage of the Yellowstone River and onto the drainage of the Madison River, where the geysers are located. But they finally found a stream that was big that ran down toward the timber. And I want to read you one more excerpt from the book of what happened then. Geysers, somebody exclaimed, and everybody spurred their tired horses forward. The men had arrived at the upper geyser basin. Walter Trumbull described the basin this way: it was nearly destitute of vegetation, but there are a few clumps of trees scattered through it, and in one place we found grass enough for the horses. The basin was chiefly on the west side of the river, but there was a narrow split, an average width of 100 yards on the east side, which was literally alive with geysers and steam jets. Langford was just as expansive. Judge then our astonishment on entering this basin to see at no great distance before us An immense body of sparkling water projected suddenly and with terrific force into the air to a projected height of over 100 feet. We had found the real geyser. In the valley before us were 1,000 hot springs of various sizes and character. The geyser basin, 2 miles long and a mile wide, was mostly covered with barren white powder, but the explorers found a place to camp where there was enough grass for their horses. The men scattered to investigate the geysers and hot springs. Langford and Hedges took off their boots to ford the Firehole River. The current dashed over the boulders, but they found a spot where the river bottom had a smooth rock surface that would allow them to cross. At the middle of the stream, Langford noticed his feet were getting hot. He recalled the tall tale of the mountain man, Jim Bridger, who said he knew of a river where the water ran so fast it made the bottom hot. Langford attributed the heat to a steam vent. So that's a couple of the descriptions of seeing the geyser basin. You can imagine the excitement of seeing it. A lasting legacy of the Washburn expedition was the name that the men gave to the geysers in the upper basin. Earlier visitors had probably conjured fanciful names of the things they had seen, but those names didn't stick. Langford commented, "We gave such names to those geysers we saw in action as we think would best illustrate their peculiarities." General Washburn published the expedition's geyser names in an article he wrote for the Helena Daily Herald. And apparently later travelers took that edition of the newspaper with them so that they could find the geysers. Because they were good descriptions of what they had seen, the name stuck. The expedition spent just over a day at the upper geyser basin because their supplies were running low. They had spent several days searching for Truman Edwards and had to move on quickly. They rushed down the Firehole River and made their way to where the Firehole joins the Gibbon to form the Madison River. And it's there that Langford says they had what's known as the Campfire Story occurred. Langford says that they were discussing what they had seen that night around the campfire and discussing the opportunities for commercializing the area. That you could homestead, say, the upper geyser basin and charge a fee to see it, or the same with the falls and other wonders of the area. And Langford says that one of the men suggested that the area be set aside as a national park, and everybody agreed except one person. So that story became the origin story of the park for several years. But historians have examined it carefully and decided that it probably never happened. No other account by the several people who wrote accounts of the trip mention the story, and it's one of the key items against it. But I do remember being told that story at a campfire at the juncture of the Gibbon and Firehole when I was a kid. So that story lasted for a long time. As soon as the expedition got out of the mountains and into the Madison Valley, they began to encounter settlements and ranches in the area. Langford rushed ahead of the group to Virginia City, where there was a telegraph office. And the next day, September 22nd, the Helena Daily Herald published the news that the expedition had returned and that Edwards was lost. Langford didn't publish anything in the Montana newspapers, but left those reports to his companions. He wrote a 2-part series for Scribner's Magazine and a long lecture about his trip that he gave in Helena and Virginia City. and then reprised in New York City and Washington, D.C. He also began lobbying the U.S. Congress to establish Yellowstone National Park. The lobbying efforts persuaded Congress to fund the Hayden expeditions of 1871 and 1872. Hayden's reports, along with the lobbying, apparently funded by the Northern Pacific Railroad, persuaded Congress to pass a bill establishing the park. President Ulysses S. Grant signed the bill on March 1st, 1872, 150 years ago, or looking at today's date, almost 150 years ago. Langford was named the first superintendent of Yellowstone Park, but that was an unpaid position, so he had to take another job, and he rarely visited there. He turned down all applications for concessions to the park. He said to protect it from shoddy developers. Some people have argued that he was probably just saving the park for the Northern Pacific, which did eventually own major concessions in the park. After his term as park superintendent, Langford returned home to Minneapolis, where he was a prominent businessman and head of the Minnesota Historical Society. When he died, newspapers across the country eulogized him as the discoverer of Yellowstone Park. Washburn died in Indiana just a few months after returning to Helena. Several other members of the expedition lived to become prominent businessmen and government officials in Montana. Doane remained in the Army and was called upon to guide the Washburn expedition and dignitaries like the U.S. Secretary of War through the park. He continued his efforts to gain fame as an explorer with an aborted effort to float down the Snake River in winter and an Arctic explanation. He even volunteered to go to Africa and look for Dr. David Livingstone, who was eventually found by Morton Stanley, who was famous for uttering the words Dr. Livingstone, I presume. At one point, Doane tried to get himself appointed as Yellowstone Park superintendent. By right of discovery, he said, but he was rebuffed. He died in Bozeman to little fanfare. His newspaper obituaries didn't even mention his role in the Washburn expedition. So that's kind of the story of my book in a couple of excerpts. So thank you for your attention. I remind you that you can order my books at your Gallatin History Museum. I have had people become confused in the past. They're real books. You can order them at Amazon, or you can go to my website or other places. I encourage you to get them from the museum. It's a great place and they can use your help. So thank you. Are there any questions?
Mark, this is Frank Fidel. I just have one question.
Okay.
It's about the geyser. Was that Old Faithful?
That was Old Faithful.
Okay.
It's one of those things you wonder about these accounts. How did it happen that they happened to be there, to arrive there at just the moment that Old Faithful was going off? But
Yeah.
several of the accounts say that, so apparently it was true. They stayed there about 36 hours and saw and named most of the major geysers, but they were in a rush to get away from, to get where they could buy food. They really were running low. They had, before they left the lake, they got Cornelius Hedges, who was an avid fisherman, to stock their larder with fish from the lake. And and Hedges is the first person that we know of to cook a fish in a hot spring without ever taking it off the fishing hook. So another little story there. But yeah, that was Old Faithful they were seeing.
Okay.
Mark,
Yes.
some of the people were afraid of Indians. I have the impression that some Indians were benign and some were violent. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure. The expedition went to the park in 1870. By that point, a number of the Indians had been sent to reservations. The Crow, which were most of the Indians in the immediate area, were peaceful at that point. They had made peace with the whites and were living on what was then a huge reservation. The expedition had to go up the east side of the Yellowstone River because at the west side of the Yellowstone River because the east side was part of the Crow Reservation at that time. So they weren't afraid of them, but there were still Sioux, Cheyenne, and Blackfeet causing trouble in the area. They would come down to raid the Crow and do damage in the area. So that was their major concern. They kept their guard on for the entire trip till they got back down to the Madison Valley. They posted guards nightly. And they thought they saw Indians a couple times in the park. They certainly saw Indian sign on their way to Tower Fall. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Thank you.
I'm
Hey,
wondering,
Mark, whatever happened to Truman Edwards?
Whatever happened to Truman Edwards? Edwards went home back east and kind of disappeared for a long time. And then his son showed up at Yellowstone Park, I think in the 1950s. He apparently went back east, got a job as a postmaster in a small town, married a 14-year-old girl, and had a son when he was nearly 70 years old. So his son lived into the 1950s, and he came back and told the story of Edwards. The other little bit about Truman Edwards is that he was in New York for a while when the guy who found him, Yellowstone Jack Barnett, who I mentioned, found him. Yellowstone Jack went to the park because Edwards' friends had offered a $600 reward for his recovery. But Edwards claimed that he would have made it out without any help and refused to pay the reward. So when Barnett met Edwards in New York City years later, the meeting didn't go well, I guess. We don't really know what happened. But Yellowstone Jack was quoted as saying, "I should have let the son of a bitch die." Edwards claimed that he was glad to be rescued, but he was perfectly fine when he was found. Yellowstone Jack said he was a madman, babbling incoherently to himself and trying to catch a frog. One of many places where you find conflicting accounts. So that's what happened to Truman Edwards. Died an obscure small town postmaster.
how did the paintings that you've put on the screen come about? Because I found it interesting way back when you said about putting pen to paper. I'm thinking, do they actually have any artists that were there to also sketch? Because just as an observation, I mean, I'm doing a little documentary, a script for documentary right now. We're looking at the original art colonies in the East Coast, in the Hudson River Valley. And it's exactly the same era in which, but for New York, it's the Industrial Revolution forcing people kind of to see nature, to see landscape, to be in the wilderness. And for them, it meant the wilderness of the Hudson River Valley. But the landscape painters that became our first, I guess, the first American school of art are doing exactly what I'm seeing on your pictures in the same time period, kind of romanticizing and some heavy realism about the wilderness. So who are doing these paintings? You mentioned Thomas Moran. Do you know, did you look into people who ultimately painted these scenes?
Thomas Moran was on the expedition the next summer with the Hayden expedition, the one that was funded by the U.S. Congress, the first official government expedition. There was an artist, I don't know to call him an artist, one of the soldiers in Doan's company of men did some sketches of the falls. They're pretty crude. There's nothing to them. Certainly Moran is a contemporary and a guy who is with the Hudson River School, that is in style and approach.
Yeah.
Some people credit Moran as being really the first landscape painter, the guy that went out to document the landscape as opposed to just make pretty pictures. So he's an important guy. He made a gigantic portrait of the falls that I didn't use. I wanted to use his sketches, which are less known. That was bought by the U.S. Congress and hung in the Capitol for years. It's now at the Smithsonian. But that was, what he said. Those sketches, the ones that I showed, are called watercolor sketches that he did in 1871 in the park. He then went back to his studio and did more elaborate paintings. Those sketches I was privileged to see about 8 years ago when I was doing some volunteer work at the Yellowstone Research Museum, Research Center. It's not a museum. And those sketches are there. Does that get at your question at all?
Yes, because it really connects him to the East Coast and exactly what was happening there with the Frederick Church and Thomas Cole and all the landscape artists there.
Yeah, Moran was a fairly prominent man by 1870. And the president of the Northern Pacific Railroad, which I mentioned several times, asked Hayden to include him in the expedition. So he wasn't technically part of the expedition. He was a guest of the expedition funded by the Northern Pacific Railroad. And those watercolor sketches are just wonderful. And as are his paintings. So you'd be well served to take a look at Thomas Moran's paintings.
Yeah.
And they're easily accessible on the web. You can find them.
Thank you.
Mark, what's your next book going to be on?
I'm probably moving away from Yellowstone for a while. I've written 6 books on it and don't have a real idea of what to do next. I've looked at the Hayden expeditions of 1871 and 1872, but most of what I can find there are government reports, and that doesn't make for a very fun book, so I don't know that I'll go there. I'm working on a memoir about the experiences I had at the University of Montana in the mid-60s, in an era of student protest and sexual revolution and artistic ferment, and the time that I fell in love and got married, and it took. So a whole bunch of stuff going on. So that's probably my next book. We'll see if that gels.
Mm-hmm.
Does anything remain of Fort Ellis?
No, Fort Ellis is about 5 miles east of Bozeman. The Fort Ellis Reservation, it was a huge chunk of real estate that ran up into the mountains. The idea of the Army in that post-Civil War era was that these forts should be self-sustaining. So they had farmland, they had timber, they had ample acreage, and as near as I can tell in looking at it, the businessmen in Bozeman were pretty jealous of that wonderful land out there. So they talked the government into giving up Fort Ellis. And the buildings were auctioned off and hauled away. And, you know, there's nothing there now but a marker saying this is the site of Fort Ellis. Really kind of sad, but that's, it was a fairly elaborate thing. I was intrigued by the job that was given to Fort Ellis. As you know, Bozeman is in the eastern third of Montana, and the charge to Fort Ellis was to maintain the peace in Montana, including that 300 miles eastward to the Dakota border. They didn't succeed in that. One of the things that Doane did, by the way, was he was one of the members in pursuit of the Nez Perce, who went through Montana in 1876. So he's an interesting man in his own right. I believe the Gallatin History Museum has Kim Scott's biography of Doane, if you're really interested in him as a character. Really interesting guy with his several efforts to lead explorations and his participation in the Indian Wars. He was at the massacre at the Marias River. He was a famous Indian fighter before he ever went on the 1870 expedition. But you get to be a famous Indian fighter by attacking a village full of women and children. But that's a different story. If you're interested in that, there's another book you could get at your Gallatin History Museum by Paul Wiley called Blood on the Marias that tells that story in detail. Any more questions?
Well, thank you all for coming. It's great to have everyone from all over. So on behalf of the museum, this was a great presentation and thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.